Well, good morning or good afternoon, good evening, depending on what time you are viewing this video. My name is Doug Roussillon. I'm a Master of Public Administrations candidate at Rutgers-Newark in the School of Public Affairs and Administration. And I was working with my professor, Greg Van Ryzen, on submitting a video about some professional volunteer experience I've had that really relates to a lot of the core values that we have learned about during our tenure here at SPAA. The situation I want to talk with everyone about today is something I've been involved with for a very long time now, back in Ringwood, New Jersey, my hometown, with a community advisory group that has been set up by the United States Environmental Protection Agency to work as a conduit of information between the community and the public agencies that are involved in making sure that the remediation taking place of contamination that has been in place for almost half a century now in Ringwood is done properly, and that the health and welfare is protected of the public in Ringwood. I have been involved with this situation for quite some time now, and I've specifically been involved with the community advisory group. And I think that some of the things that we did as a community advisory group and some of the sentiments that are put forth by the EPA and their logic of creating community advisory groups really center around the idea of public involvement and participation, which is maybe one of the most important things I've learned about at my time in SPAA with many of my different professors and classes, that public participation in the public policy process equals well-rounded policy and implementation for the public. So let's dive in. The EPA, as many people know, was established in and around 1970 by the United States of America to try to work as a safeguard for the environment in which the United States resides. Shortly after the EPA's creation, initiatives began to not just protect the environment, but also aim to remediate damages done to the environment post-industrial revolution. Remember, this is the 1970s. So technology and modernization of our society is coming to a front. And unfortunately, some of the excesses of this industrial revolution translated to dangerous contamination and waste that was spread about our country. As of mid-2019, there are more than 1,340 Superfund sites in America. These are sites that gain enough attention from the federal government that they receive that specific classification. Once a site becomes a Superfund site, new funds and resources open up to that area that may be needed to hopefully put forth the remediation on the forefront. There are likely countless toxic and dangerous areas in our country that are not classified as Superfund sites. I'm sure if anyone drives down the New Jersey Turnpike, they could get that idea pretty quick. It's somewhat ironic, maybe not so much so, that as of 2020, New Jersey has 114 class Superfund sites. I believe that is the state with the most Superfund sites in the country. And wouldn't you know that Newark, New Jersey, unfortunately, has 4 of them. Ringwood, New Jersey, and I would like to show you a geographic location, just so you have an idea of the area that we are talking about. Ringwood, New Jersey sits at the very tip of New Jersey, right on the border of New York State almost. We're about 35 miles from New York City. We have beautiful mountain ranges and streams and rivers, nature galore, that really work as a barrier almost to the modernization of our culture and society. The urbanization of New York City has yet to climb the Ramapo Mountains over Skyline Drive and spread to Ringwood. It really is a haven of nature, and it was a beautiful place to grow up in a very unique community. The reason why we're talking today about Ringwood is because back in 1950, Ford Motor Company opened up an automobile manufacturing facility that resided at the tip of Route 17 North. 287 crosses it now. If you know where the Sheraton Plaza is at the top of the state, the old Sharp Plaza, which is now, I believe, Land Rover Jaguar or something, that area is where the Ford plant used to be. Up until its closure in 1980, it was the largest automobile manufacturing facility in the country. They were pumping out cars like hotcakes. It's an also important idea to remember, too, that this was back in 1950 when this plant opened, and this was up in a part of the state that still was not yet with the times of modern society. This was one of the first real blue collar modern jobs for people that were really coming from backwoods New Jersey, that all they knew was manual labor. This was an economic boom for the area. It was seen as a revolutionary move by this corporation to set up in northern New Jersey. Again, since Ringwood is about 35 miles from New York City, this is even closer, maybe 28 miles. It's really not that far. Naturally, being a large automobile manufacturing facility, and especially at the time in the 70s, 60s, even the 80s, when technology is limited, and let's be honest, it's still limited about how to handle manufacturing waste, they produced a lot of waste naturally. And unfortunately, with a lot of details that we don't necessarily have the time to get into, Ford Motor Company ended up discovering Ringwood, New Jersey, and thought of it as a perfect place to be a potential area to receive their manufacturing waste as a dump site. Ringwood, New Jersey is a very significant area in American history because we have some of the richest magnetite iron ore in the East Coast region. And the iron mines that were discovered by the colonists in the mid to late 1600s ended up being occupied and mined. Much of those resources were used for weapons and resources in the Revolutionary and Civil Wars. It was a significant economic impact for that time prior to Ford Motor Company coming. So we had large mine pits that stretched all throughout Ringwood and the surrounding towns, Sloatsburg, New York, Suffern, New York, Sterling Forest. Some even say that maybe the mine stretched towards Pompton Lakes, towards Wanacue, New Jersey, towards Pequannock. And these mines were operated for close to 300 years. And once the mines closed in the early 1900s, we just had a mining area and community that was inactive, with a lot of these mining operations and the physical features that come with that still remaining, meaning that there were sometimes just big open mine shafts and pits around the area. And Ford Motor Company ended up catching wind of this and subsequently began to bring much of their waste into Ringwood, New Jersey. They would be trucking it from their plant in Mahwah, New Jersey, through Sloatsburg Road, coming around the Ramapo Mountains with big dump trucks of contractors that they had. And these dump trucks would back right up to these mine shafts and just let their dump down, let their tow down, and hundreds of tons of paint sludge was being trucked there on the daily. I have viewed the logs, which I don't have scanned right now, but Ford Motor Company actually had logs of the paint sludge that they were bringing, whether or not they were made after the fact or somewhat fabricated to try and give an idea of their waste disposal activities is not something that's entirely clear. But it is known to all the public agencies and the community that they were trucking a lot of paint sludge there on the regular. And what made it very interesting, and what makes it still interesting 60 years later, is that, yes, we hear in America all the time the story of a large corporation coming in and taking advantage of a somewhat unknown community, small communities, for whatever reason, resources, whatever. What makes this situation extremely unique was that it was not just Ford Motor Company that was complicit in these activities. The borough of Ringwood, as you can see here, I have a letter up from the office of our mayor in 1970, sent a letter to Mr. Henry Ford. It was actually Henry Ford II, detailing to them about the dumping activities that have been taking place in Ringwood and how they wish to try to keep that going with a revolutionary process to dispose of garbage and industrial waste. The mayor at the time apparently traveled to England to see the equipment in use. And according to this mayor, who I guess was a waste specialist, waste management specialist, it was his opinion that it's the greatest ecological advancement for solid waste disposal to date. This many years later, signed John Kulik, mayor of Ringwood. This many years later is one of the main primary documents that the EPA uses to say that the borough of Ringwood is almost just as complicit as Ford Motor Company in their dumping activities. When a Superfund site occurs, the agency does their hardest to try to figure out who did the dumping, obviously. Unfortunately, there are many times where we may have dump sites, toxic sites that, the company is no longer around. And that's when public resources might come into play to assist with the funding of remediation. However, in this case, we know that it was Ford Motor Company dumping the waste. And unfortunately, we also know that they were invited by the municipality to be there, which is obviously extremely problematic. That has made decision-making today from our borough, who is in charge of protecting the health and welfare of their community, be backed against the wall, because not only do they need to make sure the community is safe, but they need to make sure that they are mitigating liability as much as possible, because this is a litigation process, the Superfund process. So Borough of Ringwood and Ford Motor Company, they worked together back in the 60s and 70s to dump waste in Ringwood, New Jersey. And today they are on practically the same side again, trying to mitigate their liability and bring this situation to a close as fast as possible. What's really important to recognize about this situation that makes it even a little more convoluted, here's a picture of the waste to show you some of the waste. This is paint sludge that was left superficially in Ringwood, didn't make it to the mine shafts. Much of the waste sometimes was making its way just into the woods back behind a hill. You walk back there today, you might find a trashed car, you might find oil drums, you might find all kinds of things still. Here are some of the tires and other waste that is around. There's some cracked earth here in the woods back there. And here is a very powerful image of a hazmat contractor digging out a solid chunk of paint sludge from a neighbor's yard where the kids play. What makes this really important to understand is that this Superfund site, which I have circled in red here, it encompasses this entire area known as Upper Ringwood, one section of our town, of our municipality back in Ringwood, New Jersey. It's on the most northern part of our town on the border. And as you can see, there is a prominent graft stream that flows tributarily through this Superfund site into a large pond near Ringwood Manor called Sally's Pond that again flows even harder and larger into the Wanacue Reservoir. The Wanacue Reservoir is the second largest reservoir in our state, and it feeds 1/3 of our state with their public drinking water. If you aren't getting water directly from the Wanacue Reservoir, it is likely that you are getting a water product that is at some point touched by the Wanacue Reservoir. Like, we have United Water, I believe there's Suez now in Bergen County, and the Passaic Valley Water Commission also. They purchase water from the Wanacue Reservoir for distribution. Newark, New Jersey is one of the largest recipients of the Wanacue Reservoir's water. And I believe that there is a direct aqueduct that travels that water from up here down to us in Newark. So naturally, this waste hanging out in Upper Ringwood, there is significant risk of this waste possibly traveling along into the Wanacue Reservoir at some point. This is an issue that does not just affect Ringwood. Here's a nice, beautiful drone shot of the Wanacue Reservoir. Like I said, Ringwood is a very beautiful place. Now, what makes this also a little more complex is that not only do we have this very unique and abundant amount of industrial waste from Ford Motor Company in Ringwood, but where it is geographically, like we just mentioned, threatens the Wanacue Reservoir. However, there are also people that have lived in this area since the mines opened up, and likely way before then. It is an indigenous population referred to as the Ramapo Lenape Nation of New Jersey. They are known to the state of New Jersey as the Ramapo Mountain Indians, and they have been struggling for decades now to try and reach federal recognition as a Native American tribe from the United States government. And as you can see from this one picture, I have some of their homes circled here on Google Maps, and then I have what is referred to as the O'Connor disposal area right across the street from them. There is tons of superficial paint sludge just sitting there. And like I've showed you in this other picture, we have had times where the United States Environmental Protection Agency and their contractors need to go in to remove paint sludge from people's properties. So the amount of exposure that has occurred from this extremely dangerous waste to this community, the full extent of that is not really fully recognized just yet. And unfortunately, the community that has lived there for generations has suffered tremendously from this environmental travesty. There are health issues. Obviously, there are unfortunately economic issues that come from environmental racism. It's a really sad and threatening situation for this community of Upper Ringwood. And what's important to recognize, I'm going to zoom in a little bit. Here's Ringwood as a whole on Google Maps outlined, right? And this is this little, you have the green space here, which is state parkland, as you can see. This little slither of land is Upper Ringwood, where the Superfund site lays. Here's the Wanakee Reservoir, as you can see. We have other communities of Ringwood. Upper Ringwood's here. We have Cupsaw, we have Erskine, we have Skyline, and we have Stonetown. As you can see, there are streams, state parkland, creeks, hills, mountains that encapsulate Upper Ringwood to such an extent that truly does push them back from the rest of the community. Not only does it physically ostracize the community a little bit, it also ostracizes the events that took place there, i.e. the toxic waste dumping. And while much of Ringwood has remained untouched because of this toxic waste, there is still a small slither of community that has been affected by this waste, and it affects them disproportionately and adversely. Now, what we saw before with the letter, I want to go back to that. Give me 1 second, please. In this letter in 1970, the mayor clearly explicitly states to Ford that one of the problems at the time with our operations at that site, which still remains, is there are many hundreds of people, in parentheses, a minority group, living in the area. To briefly address that, it would appear that decisions were made in the past, and perhaps still today, are made in the light of understanding that there is an ostracized, outcasted group of people there that, to the powers that be at this time, clearly did not take seriously this group's indigenous disposition and commitment to their land. So it affects a group of people adversely and disproportionately, which is extremely important to recognize in this situation. There are not many Superfund sites in this country where there are people that literally live in, around, and on top of toxic waste. It's a problem. Now, there were many cleanups that occurred in Ringwood. It was first listed on the Superfund site list in 1983, and it was taken off subsequently in 1994. Ford and the EPA informed the community in 1994 that the site was clean. No more problems. The paint sludge is gone. The community disagreed. They were finding paint sludge all over the place. EPA ordered Ford to come back and do more sites. More cleanups, I apologize. They did about maybe 6 more major cleanups from 1994 to 2006, I think it was, or 2005. And when they kept digging for paint sludge to dig some out, they kept finding more and more paint sludge. When they kept digging, more paint sludge was coming up. This led the United States Environmental Protection Agency to make history in their Superfund program by making the Ringwood Superfund site the first site in the history of the program to be listed on the national priorities list as a Superfund site, taken off because the agency said it was all good, and then put back on because the agency unfortunately had to admit that they were incorrect. What I have here listed for you is an Inspector General's report of the United States Environmental Protection Agency back from late 2007 that literally details a limited investigation led to miscontamination at the Ringwood Superfund site. Residents weren't being listened to. The experts thought that they knew where the sludge was, and they were wrong. So fast forward about 10 years later from that, still on the Superfund site list. Unfortunately, lots of turmoils in the community. Jacobs Engineering, which is an engineering firm that was retained by the North Jersey District Water Supply Commission. They are the ones that keep care of the Warnicke Reservoir. They had retained Jacobs for a number of years to do testing of the Warnicke Reservoir on the northern tip, closest to the Superfund site. And they were testing the soil that was on their property and the water in that area. They found extremely small trace amounts of chemicals that are in high amounts at the Superfund site. And what they detail in their report, because of one of the chemicals here, 1,4-dioxane, it's a chemical that the agencies still don't really know too much about, but is ever present in many different water supplies across the country. They detail that their filtration plant, the plant that filters the water before it goes to the aqueduct, before it gets to Newark, New Jersey, and other places, their existing plant cannot remove 1,4-dioxane. So if the contaminant were to reach the water, it could be a serious problem. Now, when that report came out, the borough of Ringwood responded in a much different way than a lot of people would think. Communication and trust and relationships have been extremely hard to harbor and sustain in Ringwood in this issue. And there has always been a downplaying of the issue from our public officials, unfortunately. And one of their responses to this situation was to retain a public relations firm called MWW Public Relations to help take some of these technical documents, such as the Jacobs report, to synthesize this extremely complex and technical information to the average person, because naturally the average person doesn't have time or the mental capacity to try and understand these extremely long technical documents. And it sounds like a great idea. It sounds extremely important. And if you were to go to this site today, I think it's ringwoodfacts.org. If you were to read that site, you would think that there really is no problem in Ringwood, New Jersey, that there is no issue, environmental issue. And the way that we can see that is because they took things from this is a snippet from their website, the ringwoodfacts.org. They detail some key takeaways from the Jacobs report. The chemical has not been detected in the reservoir, and the probability of the chemical reaching the reservoir's treatment plant is low. Yes, Jacobs did say that. But what this website failed to mention was also the other conclusion that Jacobs made, that if it does reach, which there is a chance, although low, it will impact the water quality for not just Ringwood, but all the recipients also. And I say all this to zero in to help you understand that communication has always been a big issue with a situation that's been as dragged out and as complex and as layered as this. So what the EPA does in certain situations like this is they create community advisory groups. And they create community advisory groups in situations where there is obvious turmoil and distrust within communities. It's supposed to be a board made up of the community and different relevant officials to work as a conduit of information from the site to the general public. And the CAG was organized in the late 90s in Ringwood, New Jersey. And when they were first coming around, there were some different players that were sitting on this board, such as licensed site remediation professionals, LSRPs. And we had different private organizations and nonprofits that were participating on this board for a time that were able to secure funds for these professionals. So then the community advisory group and the community would be able to have independent results and information. Information that was not coming from the borough of Ringwood or the EPA or Ford. And that's important because it's not, as a lot of the things that we just covered, we see that that trust has always been missing and the need for dialogue has always been needed. And the idea of the community advisory group is extremely important. And bylaws were created and specific functions were defined, and all on paper, it sounds like a great idea, where members of Ford, the borough, New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, the US EPA, the community from Upper Ringwood, the community from outside of Upper Ringwood and Ringwood, all attending a meeting just to see what's going on and get progress reports and dialogue about issues, because obviously the issues that the community sees day in and day out may be entirely different from what contractors and officials see the dispersed amount of times that they might be in the area. So it's important that there's clear lines of communication, and that's what the CAG ought to do and ought to be. And unfortunately, however, because theory never really manifests towards implementation the way that we would like it, which is something I've learned about in my master's program here at Rutgers, there was a lot of dysfunction within our community advisory group that perhaps has been even more of a detriment to the situation than it was in the first place. The bylaws that were approved by the EPA for the community advisory group, which I will pull up for you, give me 1 minute. These were established in 2009 from some help from the Edison Wetlands Association, and they detail membership, and it does detail that Ford can have representatives appointed by the EPA, the Ringwood Borough can have representatives appointed by the EPA. They have the bandwidth to sit with the community on this board, which is great. And unfortunately, what came from much of these meetings or work sessions to try and make these boards, full of membership that would be productive and have action items, follow-ups, progress reports, accountability, unfortunately got very quickly politicized. Ringwood is a partisan municipality, bipartisan municipality, I apologize, as most of our municipalities are in New Jersey. We don't have many nonpartisan municipalities anymore, and we have a lot of diehard Republicans and Democrats in the town, in our borough, that unfortunately see that issue more important than the actual issues at hand, such as this Superfund site. It's really turned into a Democrat versus Republican thing, which is really not what the situation is supposed to be. It's supposed to be about assuring the safety and health of the people that are near this Superfund site and ensuring that the toxic waste that is there is handled appropriately and correctly and legally. Because of that politicization of the board, we had the borough bringing a bunch of their Republicans on, and then we had the Democratic committee within the borough of Ringwood also appointing their representatives to this board, where it turned into a Democrat versus Republican battle every meeting instead of actually talking about what the issues are and what's going on. Furthermore, what makes it a problem is that all of the membership of the community advisory group unfortunately formulated to people that really had no expertise or true stake in the game. We had just members of Ringwood, but unfortunately, all those members of Ringwood, there was only one that was from Upper Ringwood that could be a voice, eyes, and ears for the community that unfortunately has been marginalized for generations. And that creates a big problem because we need to have more representation of the people that are actually affected. And furthermore, we need professionals on this site that are independent from the agencies that are involved to try and provide a third-party, unbiased, impartial opinion and analysis of things that are going on. We did have a lot of different things that this community advisory group did when there were nonprofits with independent funds and resources involved. Tests would be showing different things that would make the agencies act differently. And we were able to have clear recommendations from the community to the agencies that were sometimes implemented, such as publishing work schedules, having community advocates hang around while work is going on during the day to speak with the community and let them know what's happening. We did have a lot of those things, and unfortunately, a lot of that has disappeared. And this Superfund site really isn't going anywhere. Unfortunately, the decision has been made to leave most of the waste in Ringwood, New Jersey, which is a problem. But at the same time, too, it poses a great technological and monetary obstacle to try and remove this waste safely, especially while there are people living there. And while that's the case, if that's the conclusion that the waste needs to remain there, then the community needs to be involved and informed so we can make sure that this work is being done safely while there are people living there. And what has become of the CAG now is almost nothing, because the CAG does not meet anymore. There are efforts to try and bring it together, but unfortunately the community in Upper Ringwood, which is the most important voice in this case, are more concerned about worrying about the health and well-being and positioning of them and their families, and they don't necessarily have the time and bandwidth anymore to be getting involved with this extremely long, dragged out issue. So what's important is to recognize that we have public programs in place that on paper sound really great and are great ideas. But if they're not taken seriously by the agencies that are facilitating them, does it create more damage than good? Because that's kind of been the situation that we see here in Ringwood. There are still countless miscommunications. Schedules are provided to us about work, and then much of the work is done way ahead of schedule without anyone being informed. And the mistrust and the miscommunication resides, as well as the toxic waste does. And I think that we have seen throughout the course of time in New Jersey, in America, in our modern societies, where we do have these public programs that get purported and supported and facilitated by some public agencies. Let's think about DARE for a second, right? That look good on paper and they sound great. So they get time and energy and resources funneled into them, but then consistently come up short with performance tracking. Has the body done anything? Has any improvements been made? That's the important question that we need to ask. And in order for programs like this to take off and have the productivity that they deserve, it needs to have an involved and committed public to be allowed to be there and be allowed to partake in these conversations. In the case of Ringwood, New Jersey, if there was more community involvement and honest communication from the get-go, it's very likely that maybe lives could have been saved. Public involvement is one of the most important aspects of our society. And it's important that when policy is being discussed, when programs are being discussed, that things are being discussed realistically and fully. The situation in Ringwood is one that I hold very dear to me, that I will always be paying attention to and always being there for my friends and their families. And it's something that all of you could also follow along with also as time progresses. But the most important thing about this presentation and how it relates to our program, the MPA program back at the School of Public Affairs and Administration in Rutgers-Newark, is that community involvement can make or break a program. Community involvement can make or break a policy. And it's important that the community, which we create policy to serve, is involved. Who knows better than how a policy will affect them than those to be affected by the policy? I appreciate you tuning in for this presentation. Please feel free to email me at dougruccione, RUCCIONE @gmail.com with any questions. And I look forward to speaking with anyone soon. Thanks again.